There's a quote attributed to Jim Morrison, the vocalist of The Doors: "No one gets out of here alive." I've recently completed an article called On Mortality and Living Life. Primarily, we'll be talking about getting the most out of life, living to the fullest. I'm Ben Ufana. If you haven't already done so, do look below, click like and subscribe. Let's dive into it. For years, I've used Facebook quite a bit differently from the way most people do. I purposely go to the pages of certain news organizations or the actual journalist who I follow, and I will go over into the search box to the top left, and I can see a listing which ones have posted new articles, and that's how I keep up with what's going on in the world. But I noticed when I looked over, I could see the top of my feed, and I saw a post that a friend of mine, someone that I've known for over 30 years, had recently passed away. And I was a bit stunned at first. I didn't realize she was in quite that bad of shape, that she was about to make her exit from the world. But I clicked on the link and went to her page, and I could see that her son and some of her other friends had posted. Now, when I first met Mary, I was seeking relief for a bee sting. She was working for an herbalist at the time. But when I described to her my training with a traditional Native American doctor, a medicine man, she immediately responded with, "I want to try that." For years, Mary had been in psychotherapy, like over a decade. And despite all those years in therapy, she had years of her childhood completely blacked out, no recollection. But during that first session, she began to recover memories of being physically and sexually abused by her father and began to cry profusely. And at that stage, I was just beginning my practice. I wasn't quite sure what to do. And so I sat there just caressing her back to comfort her. Mary ended up working with me for quite a few years. So much of that trauma healed. She became much stronger. She opened up a business of her own. And even after I left Kansas City, we kept in touch and have for all these years. During my early years, I didn't lose too many people. The first significant loss I remember was my grandfather. I think I was maybe around 6 or 7. And it didn't fully register with me at the time. It was just, well, it's not there anymore. Shortly before my 14th birthday, my stepfather was using an electric saw to cut a piece of PVC pipe, and the saw shorted out on him, electrocuted him. I found his body, and that was traumatic at the time. And then making my way to Oklahoma at the age of 17 and seeing a number of my peers, usually it's alcohol related, and people were dying in car crashes and drinking too much and choking on their vomit or from cirrhosis of the liver. So quite a few people in the community were dying. It was quite a shock to see the number of people in the Native communities that were drinking so heavily. Again, I want to mention that also among Native Americans, there's the largest group of people who completely abstain from drinking alcohol, and for good reason. At 29, one of my best friends from high school was struck by a car, and he died shortly thereafter. And then in 2011, I was coming out of Whole Foods. I was in the Boston area at the time, and I noticed there was a message on the Facebook Messenger app. And I opened it up, and it was from my half sister. And so I'm looking into my phone at the message, and the first words that I saw were, "He died today." And I immediately jerked the phone away from my face. And then as I brought the phone back in closely and read more closely, and it was saying he shot himself around 9:30 this morning. And that's how I learned of my father's suicide. Spending time in Sri Lanka during its nearly 30-year war brought me much closer to death on a mass scale. During the final stages of the war, there's estimated by the United Nations something like about 40,000 ethnic Tamil civilians were killed when the Sri Lankan military were raining bombs and artillery and executing people, surrendering LTTE or Liberation Tiger Tamil Elam cadres en masse. The International Crisis Group say that it could be as high as 70,000. And a number of my friends actually survived the killing fields at that time. There were several incidences in which I had walked past bombings in which people had died. One only minutes after it occurred, and smoke was still coming off the wreckage of what had been a trishaw, or one of those three-wheel taxis where someone had detonated a claymore mine. The scene was pretty intense there, is that mine had been packed with ball bearings, and there was cinder block walls on both sides of the road. And you could see with the explosion, those ball bearings flew in every direction, and all the windows above that line of the cinder block wall with the apartment building on the other side were blown out. The music we listen to, and even the songs that are playing in the background during our childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, become woven into the narrative of our lives, and they play a significant role in our worldview. And many of the recording artists who were a big part of the soundtrack of my youth, like Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, George Harrison, Frank Zappa, David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Tom Petty, they're no longer on the planet now. And even though I'm mostly listening to jazz and experimental music, I find it a bit disconcerting or unsettling because they were at one time an integral part of my understanding of the world. I spent years training with a traditional Native American doctor, a medicine man, and I work with people with such a wide range of issues, anything from heart disease and stroke and digestive and respiratory disorders. Also, people struggling with anxiety, depression, and helping people to recover after a devastating breakup or divorce. But there are times where, especially working with elderly people, that they're on very shaky ground. They have a very tenuous grasp on reality. They're just hanging on by a thread. And there are times where I've worked with people with late stage cancer and would help them to transition, to go across, and other people were able to go into remission. But a number of elderly people that I've worked with, either they were referred to me and maybe they told the person who had initially referred them that they didn't expect to be around that much longer, or they may have said it to me as well, something to the effect of, well, I don't think I'm going to be around that much longer. I don't expect to live through another winter. And despite that, I'd start working with these individuals, and again, I could see that they were barely hanging on. But there's always the part of me that, on one hand, I feel a little anxious or unsettled. I recognize the crises, and it's like, oh, what can we do to get this person back in their body and to enliven, to revitalize the internal organs, to build in that resilience? And I've had quite a few people over the years, as I said, primarily elderly people who didn't expect to be around that much longer. And as I was working with them, they became more resilient, their bodies stronger and more lucid, and they were more engaged in their lives. And they'd end up living often another 5 or 10, 15 or more years. In fact, one elderly Jewish man, Maurice, I first worked with him, I think mid to late 70s somewhere, and he was consistent. See him at least once a month. And I kept working with him up to the time he moved out of senior housing to go live with a much younger brother. And shortly thereafter, one of his sons, who was living in Mumbai with his wife, brought his father over to India, and that's where Maurice spent his final years, and he lived until the age of 96. So there's always this part of me, it's like, well, how long can we extend this person's time on earth? In my mid to late 20s, I found myself consumed by overwhelmingly painful emotions as I was reenacting the traumas of my childhood and adolescence in my attempt to form romantic or intimate relationships. Again, pain was excruciating, and I would have all this graphic suicidal imagery. Parts of me that just didn't want to live. And yet, I also remember the words of friends that I'd spoken with about those who had attained mastery in a number of the ancient spiritual traditions. And they'd talk about those who had died before their time, and the way they would get stuck in between worlds, and that they weren't able to transition or move across to the other side. And I certainly didn't want to get stuck in between like that. So I just persevered. I determined to push on just to get through it. The steps that I took to heal the deep emotional wounding, I mean, I would dive into the depths of all that pain until I came out the other side. It would put me into such a profound altered state, but I would just keep breathing from the depths of that pain, sometimes for hours at a time. And so the running joke I had with myself in those times was, well, what drug am I on today? But the combination of working with this intensive practice, later incorporating Qigong, and also the various therapeutic interventions, getting lots of deep tissue body work, working with gifted healers, going through so many vision quests as I have, it enabled me to heal and transform the deep emotional wounding, the trauma, and come out the other side much stronger and more resilient. And even though I'm no longer in that kind of intensely vulnerable space, I continue to work with this practice on a daily basis. I drop my awareness into the depths of any feelings and sensations that arise. And as I do so, there's a greater sense of empathy and compassion. Now, every one of us are born into our family of origin, and our experience can vary so radically depending on the set of parents we end up with. Some of us maybe have just one parent, or foster parents, or whatever configuration we find ourselves in. Some parents or caregivers are loving, supportive, and understanding, and instill qualities like empathy and resilience, integrity and confidence, responsibility. Others can say and do lots of hurtful things, and maybe we're subjected to neglect or physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. And that has a huge bearing, a huge impact when it comes to shaping us as individuals, determining how we develop into the people that we become. And I believe that most parents are, for the most part, doing the best they can with the understanding and the resources that they possess. Obviously, that's not always the case, but even the best of parents, everyone's going to have their off days. The fact that most of us were not taught how to work effectively with our emotions, and either we didn't know about or didn't have access to the therapeutic interventions that would facilitate the healing of our deep emotional wounds. And as a result, much of the trauma and the distressing emotions that we couldn't digest remains trapped within our bodies. In many instances, our lives become this endless series of painful reenactments with the patterns that begin to develop, going as far back as childhood, becoming more deeply entrenched. Even though we may not fully realize the extent, having numbed ourselves and disconnected from our authentic emotional responses, many of us contract around these deeply wounding experiences. And this can have an incapacitating effect, preventing us from developing or accessing the resources that we need to be fully functional. Ultimately, this hinders us from fully engaging with in living our lives. And I'm just realizing I didn't mention it earlier, but I will be referring to my notes and reading some sections because I include so much detail in these articles that it's just humanly impossible to remember everything I'd like to include here. Anyway, let's dive back in. Even if we've suffered tremendous abuse or whatever traumas, whether in our childhood or other periods in our life, we always have a choice. Like so many others, we could choose to define ourselves by our suffering, and we could contract around the deeply wounding experiences. And we also have the option to embrace these parts of our lived experiences and see them as opportunities. In fact, it's those of us who have faced adversity head on and taken the steps to facilitate our healing, doing the deep level processing of our emotions and worked with these various therapeutic interventions. By doing so is that we're able to develop the capabilities and the resources that enable us to live more meaningful and fulfilling lives. Over the years, I think much of it has to do with all the intensive practice that I do, meditations of going into feeling and physical sensation within the body, the Qigong practice, going through so many vision quests. I've developed these capacities that many people have yet to develop, if they ever do. One, being able to look into people's bodies and minds, and I could see what they're going through, the kinds of issues they're struggling with, how it's affecting them emotionally, how it's manifesting in their bodies. And so as I look into people's bodies and minds, especially starting with younger people, working with children, adolescents, and young adults, one of the things that has become so readily apparent to me is these generative cycles that drive us from infancy through early adulthood. And because of these generative cycles, as we come in to this world, we're compelled to learn and explore and to develop new resources. We're constantly growing and adapting to the world around us. Part of it's out of curiosity and also necessity. And then there's also the emotional, cognitive, and social development that occurs. And then as we're growing into adolescence, into our adulthood, we're further refining our skills as well as our sense of self. However, as we grow older, and this really starts to become apparent with people in their 30s, but becomes much more exaggerated 40s and 50s, 60s, and on, is that these generative processes slow down and the drive to explore, to push beyond our boundaries becomes less urgent. And it's often replaced by a desire for stability and comfort. You see, as many of us grow older, we're seeking comfort and we become more resistant to change. And this resistance often intensifies when we're carrying all this unresolved trauma and distressing emotions within our bodies because it causes us to contract. So whenever we attempt to push beyond our limitations, what happens is it stirs up the very traumas and all these emotions that we've held inside for so long. And because of that, for many of us, the resources we need to continue growing remain inaccessible, either because we haven't developed those capacities or because we've accumulated so much stress and unprocessed emotion that we haven't either developed those capacities or because the accumulated stress and emotions have disconnected us from our inner core being, from the higher power, and from the generative forces that would initiate new cycles of growth and development. And as a result, we often become bound by these limitations. We're stunted in our growth and we become stagnant, unable to tap into the deeper potential for healing and transformation that would compel us to keep evolving. In our modern world, there's so much emphasis that's placed on youth and physical beauty, material wealth, and how well one does financially is often seen as the ultimate measure of success. In the past, we were primarily influenced by family, friends, members of our communities. And while this still happens to some degree, we're now exposed to a never ending stream of advertisements, influencers that are continually shaping our mindset and overall outlook on life. And the problem with this model is that beauty fades and we all grow old, and our money and material possessions ultimately provide little lasting fulfillment. In fact, once beauty fades and people grow older, they often find themselves isolated and feeling cut off. Among various Native American tribes, both life and death were seen as a part of a greater continuum of existence. In many ways, it felt as though the veil between worlds was much thinner, and there was a sense of being connected to one's forebears whose presence could often be felt. And Native life largely revolved around ceremonial events such as the Sundance, which invoked the assistance of other forces and beings. Through these ceremonies, there's a deep feeling of connection to something greater than oneself, a recognition that life extended beyond the physical world and was intertwined with the spiritual realm. Among other indigenous groups in ancient cultures, as well as within various spiritual traditions, there's also a strong sense of connection to the ancestors. And there was also the invocation of other forces or beings. And it was common to hear accounts of individuals transitioning at the end of their lifetime only to reincarnate within another body, continuing the cycle of existence. During the time that I was training with Shifu Li Tai Liang, a Chinese master, in the internal martial arts of Xing Quan, Baguazhang, Tai Chi, and Qigong, we would get into these lengthy conversations. His English wasn't all that great, and sometimes we had to rely a lot on Google Translate, but we did manage to communicate and share what it is that we want to convey to one another. But at one point, he was sharing with me this Taoist perspective, and he was explaining to me how, as we come into this life and along the way, we experience these various traumas, and our bodies end up holding on to all these emotions like anger and resentment and fear and sadness and grief. As I mentioned earlier, have not learned how to work effectively with our emotions. We're not processing, we're not digesting these emotions. And so whatever we fail to digest remains trapped within our bodies indefinitely. Now, what Shifu was explaining is that we go through these traumas, these very stressful, upsetting, distressing life events, and we're holding all this unprocessed emotion, this residual within our body, and it creates this heaviness. And from the Taoist perspective, he was saying that when one transitions to the other side, when one leaves their body at the end of their life, that all this residual is so heavy that it cannot go out with them. They cannot take this part of their essence, part of their self with them. And so they're leaving parts of themselves behind. And as that happens, it's like you go out, there's less of you, you're diminished. And with that, there's what's the word? You devolve instead of evolution. It's the exact opposite of that. Conversely, as we heal and transform, as we take the steps to do what is required to heal, it's facilitating not only our healing and our growth, our personal development in this time, but that growth, that transformation carries over into the afterlife and into subsequent lifetimes. So we come back into this world in another life. Again, that's the Taoist perspective that he related to me. Circling back around to the practice that I began to develop on my own instinctually during my mid to late 20s, when I found myself consumed by all that, at times excruciating pain, reenacting the traumas of my childhood and adolescence. And I would instinctively dive into all those painful emotions, breathing softly and deeply from the depths of those feelings until I'd come out the other side. And by doing so, it's engaging that innate healing intelligence residing within the body and mind, is that would happen at a certain point, I could feel the pain breaking open, oftentimes coming out of my body in waves. And then I would experience these profound emanations of warmth beginning to flow from within, a growing sense of lightness, ease. I was becoming more resilient. Also, working with this practice has the effect of stripping down all these layers that we tend to build up over ourselves. And as that happened, I could feel a greater sense of connection to this authentic core residing within, to the higher power, and to that greater continuum of existence. It can be difficult for us to fully register the implications of our actions in the moment, but looking back, it's easy to recognize some of the mistakes that we're making. As I look back over the course of my own life, I would say one of my greatest regrets is how I took for granted the people who had played a significant part in my life. I lost touch, for instance, with three Japanese women that I've been friends with. I spent an enormous amount of time with while I was in college. And then during the 4 months that I lived in Las Vegas, there's a roommate that he and I really connected on a lot of levels. But I was still in the midst of my apprenticeship with my mentor, Horace. And when he showed up after some months to pick me up, and we took off back on the road, and I was so dissociated at that time. I just wasn't fully inhabiting my body. And I just failed to recognize the profound value of these connections that I shared with these individuals. And I deeply regret that I lost touch with them. And although I've tried, I have no way of finding or reconnecting with them, at least not to my knowledge. I knew from the age of 14 that I wanted to apprentice with one of the traditional Native American doctors. But there is a prejudice among some of the Kiowa and other Native Americans that their thinking or their attitude was, well, the medicine's not going to work for you. It only works for someone who was born Native. So when I began my apprenticeship with my mentor, Horace Delkai, who's one of the last surviving traditional doctors, medicine men among the Kiowa tribe, I basically disappeared. Hardly anyone knew where I was at for at least a good 3 years. I just, in a sense, dropped off the planet. But there was one point where I was with Horace and we made a trip back to Oklahoma, and we stopped in to visit the elderly man, Jack, who first took me into the peyote meetings when I first arrived in Oklahoma when I was 17. And I'd spent an enormous amount of time with Jack. In addition to the meetings, I would sit with him for hours as he'd share with me these accounts of the Kiowa warriors and traditional doctors from times past, and many of them possessing various paranormal abilities. And I was so transfixed with these accounts that he would share with me. But as I was sitting there in Jack's living room with Jack, his wife, and with my mentor Horace, and Jack was looking into my eyes and he just said it emphatically, "We've missed you." But at the time, I was so dissociated. I was not present within my body that it wasn't fully registering. Sadly, I never saw Jack again after that visit. A few years afterwards, he passed away. And I very much regret that I wasn't there during those final years of his life. And there have been so many times when I regret that I can't just sit down and talk with them. There were so many things that I experienced while I was apprenticing with my mentor Horace that I wish I could share back and forth with him. I know I would gain a lot of insight. I know he would really like to hear what I experienced, what I've gone through, especially all these times that I've gone through the Vision Quest as the Kiowa people and other Native Americans have for centuries gone through the vision quest, but he's gone now. And so, one of the big lessons that I've gained, which I feel was so important for every one of us, is that the importance of being truly present to the best of our ability and really appreciating the people who are a part of our lives. Another important issue here, many of us hold back on expressing our interest in someone or our desire out of fear of rejection. And yes, rejection can hurt, but to the best of our ability, it's important for us to learn to engage. And in many instances, that means testing the water, expressing our interest, and showing our desire to know someone better, to spend more time with them, or to become more intimate. And we also need to be mindful of the other person at the same time, sensing their receptivity or possibly their lack thereof. And if they're not able to reciprocate, it's important for us to respect their feelings and boundaries. And even if it doesn't work out, at least you'll know. And who knows, maybe it will work out. One of the big mistakes that I made was trying desperately at times to hold on to a relationship or a partner or someone I wanted to be with, even when they were being incredibly hurtful or abusive or unavailable or disinterested, or when the relationships just weren't working. And a big part of the way that I did that was by avoiding all the painful emotions I didn't want to feel, suppressing those emotions or distracting myself. And also, as I said, trying so hard to make those relationships work. By doing so, I was only prolonging my suffering. Yes, it can hurt terribly when someone breaks up with us, when they ghost us, when they're unfaithful, or when they say or do things that are causing a lot of hurt and also triggering our fears of being rejected or abandoned. Yet, in these instances, it is critically important for us to step out of our fantasies and to fully acknowledge the reality of the situation. Breathing softly and deeply from the depths of all those feelings helps us to digest our heartache and all those emotions attached to it. And for me, combining the practices with the most effective therapeutic interventions, deep tissue body work, the sessions I've done with gifted healers, and all the many vision quests that I've gone through, that's enabled me to transform the suffering of the heartbreak. And in doing so, it's greatly increased my capacity to love and to be loved. And also, those who have had the opportunity to work with me individually have experienced a similar transformation, healing the devastation of the breakup or divorce or being ghosted, being able to let go of those destructive, those toxic relationships that aren't working. And I've had a number of these individuals get to a place where they were able to attract someone into their life whom they could establish a much deeper, much more fulfilling and more meaningful connection. Saying what needs to be said is also critically important here. Saying what you're truly feeling rather than holding everything inside helps to clear the air for a deeper understanding of ourselves and others, while also helping us to grow closer. And at the same time, it's also crucial for us to find the balance between being open and being tactful and considerate. It's just as vital to know when communication is futile, because we need to also recognize those instances when it's better to just walk away rather than continuing to engage with someone who cannot or will not hear you. And another aspect of healthy relating is learning to assert your basic needs while still considering the needs of others. These needs can include needs for emotional support, respect, clear communication, for personal space. And for example, you might express your desire for more quality time together or set boundaries around how you wish to be communicated with or spoken to. But it's essential to advocate for yourself while also listening and responding to the needs of those around you, striking that balance that encourage a mutual respect and understanding. And it's not just about saying what needs to be said, are asserting our own needs, we also need to be willing to give in return, because healthy and loving relationships are built upon reciprocity. So, yes, I do assert my needs. I do ask for what it is that I want or need on many occasions. But as I'm doing so, I'm also thinking of that individual. And if I don't repay it in every instance to that specific individual, which I do make a concerted effort to do so, as I go down the road, I often consider other individuals that I encounter along the way and how can I be there to show consideration and to help to address their needs. I also feel it's critically important for us to the best of our ability, be facing the issues head on, dealing with our authentic emotional responses to the many challenges, the issues that we're facing within our lives. And one of the most disempowering things I see so many people do is the fact that they fail to deal with the issues that need to be addressed. They're not facing the issues head on, but that's so crucial for both their personal growth and for all of us, for our personal growth and for maintaining healthy relationships. Because whenever we're avoiding or pretending that our problems don't exist, it only allows them to escalate. It often leads to greater stress, misunderstandings, and even more pain down the road. And by confronting the issues head on as they arise, we gain clarity. We're able to work towards resolution. And approaching life with this solution oriented mindset builds inner strength and resilience, and it empowers us to create meaningful change, and it encourages greater accountability, something that is applicable to all of our relationships. And it is essential for every one of us to learn to work effectively with our emotions, because avoiding them often leads to more damaging consequences, such as emotional or psychological distress and the perpetuation of our dysfunctional patterns. This avoidance can also make us more prone to accidents and injury. It eventually manifests as illness or disease within our bodies. And when we're holding these traumas, the subsequent emotional responses, the sadness and fear and grief and anger and frustration, we're more likely to attract the same kinds of people and reenact the same kinds of dynamics are events that we experienced early on that initially traumatized us or left us deeply wounded. Now, a lot of this avoidance stems from societal norms that discourage healthy emotional expression, or often a lack of knowledge or understanding of our emotions. We just never were taught. And so we spent much of our lives numbing or avoiding our emotions. And while that may provide momentary relief, it often results in additional stress and misunderstandings and unresolved issues that continually perpetuate themselves. And by learning to work effectively with our authentic emotional responses, we gain clarity. It builds resilience within us. And we cultivate this deeper and more meaningful connection with ourselves. We're developing a deeper, stronger connection with our own core being, with the higher power, and with other people, with all life for that matter. As we move through life, our perception of time shifts dramatically. In our teens, it seems like we have our lives before us, and it feels as though time, in some instances, drags on forever. And yet, as the years pass, it's like the pace of life speeds up. Responsibilities, demands upon us increase, and the realization that time is finite begins to sink in. Urgency. And for many of us, this shift triggers an urgency to reassess our lives, leading us to questions like, what can I be doing of value with the time I have left? And it's not just a practical question, but also a deeply existential one. And we begin to wonder how we can make the most of our days, not just in terms of our achievements, but in terms of purpose and fulfillment. And the focus shifts from accumulating accomplishments to making a meaningful contribution that has a lasting impact. For me, it has at times been quite frustrating, and I've wanted to walk away when people are being flaky or indifferent. But there are those who have genuinely benefited from my work, their bodies, the deep emotional wounds healed, their lives transformed. And writing these articles and recording the videos gives me the opportunities to share the insights and the many practices that I've developed during my time here on the planet, giving me the opportunity to pass them on to future generations. And it's my way of making a lasting impact long after I'm gone. For so many of us, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the demands of life or the pressure to succeed. But meaningful contributions often come with acts of kindness and empathy. Adopting a shelter cat or dog, for instance, is not only changes your life, but you may be saving the life of the dog or cat that you take in, also adding companionship and purpose to yours. Being a mentor, whether offering guidance in school or life skills or emotional support to a child, an adolescent, maybe even a young adult, can profoundly impact their future and your own sense of contribution. Strive to be fully present in your relationships by showing appreciation, listening actively, engaging deeply with the people who matter most. Even simple things like the basic human courtesy of returning a phone call. Also, volunteering your time, your talents, or resources to causes that you care about creates a ripple effect of positive change in the world. It's also important for you to be reflecting on the areas of your life that need healing and growth, and to be seeking out the tools and the mentors or spiritual practices that facilitate your healing and personal development. And whether it's through some form of creative expression, therapy, meditation, or something more intensive, such as the vision quest that I go through, investing in your inner world enables you to contribute outwardly. And finally, record your thoughts and insights. Pass on your lessons to the next generation, whether through writing, teaching, or meaningful conversation. And what you share today may profoundly impact someone's life, either here and now or somewhere down the road. Another key to living a meaningful life is pursuing your passions, whether it's the work you love or something you've always wanted to try. And this could mean taking steps towards a career that aligns with your values, or finally giving yourself the freedom to explore some creative pursuit. It's equally important for you to embrace opportunities for adventure, whether through traveling to new places or even living in locations that you've always felt a strong desire to be, and spending time with the people who matter most, especially those with whom you share a deep connection, is invaluable. In conclusion, I want to say ultimately, living a meaningful life isn't about grand gestures or worldly success. It's about how we touch the lives of others, how we contribute in ways both large and small, and how we cultivate compassion and love and understanding while we're still here. Living with integrity, staying true to ourselves and our values ensures that our actions align with who we truly are. And continually striving to learn and grow and to remain authentic allows us to leave a legacy that isn't measured by material possessions, but by the impact we've made upon the lives of others. I want to thank those of you who've joined me. And for a more in depth exploration, be sure to click the link and read the more detailed article that will be posted. If you're seeing this video on YouTube, will be posted below. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to click like and subscribe.